Good conversation, guys. See you next time.
Good evening and welcome to Know Before You Grow, a subcommittee of Petaluma Urban Chat. I'm Dan Like, and as always, thanks to Dave Alden and Sharon Kirk for doing all the real work. We only have a couple of announcements of upcoming things today. Tomorrow at noon or 1:45, depending on who you listen to, at Aqua's Cafe, we'll be getting together for a freewheeling open discussion of whatever people bring up. It's usually quite good. And then on June 14th, we're going to have the Petaluma committee that brought the AIA SDAT team to town to talk with us and field questions about that, the AIA SDAT report. And GPAC is supposed to get around to sea level rise next month, but they don't have an announced meeting time. Usually they're the third Thursday, but that might come up as a fairly short notice Saturday meeting. Keep that in mind. With that out of the way, this evening, Dave, do you want to introduce anything?
Yeah, actually, let me say a couple things if I could. And actually, Dan, don't mean to step on your toes, but let me clarify a couple of things you said. The 11:45 versus noon at Aquas tomorrow is the conversation will begin at noon. If you want to order food, get there at 11:45. And then with regard to, you mentioned AIA SDAT, but I don't think you ever said that this is the report that's more commonly referred to as 15-minute neighborhoods. How do we get the general plan, the zoning code aligned with that concept, and then how do we really make it happen after that? It would be a fundamental change in how this community or really any community of this size works. It should be a fascinating conversation. Anybody who maybe watched the GPAC meeting last week heard something about it. We now want to repeat what the GPAC did, but in person with the additional personal interactions that happen when you are face to face. So, okay, going from there. Tonight's topic will be office to residential conversion. Is it feasible? Does it work? Does it help? We're going to start with about 15 or 18 minutes of a video from the San Francisco Planning and Urban Research Association, more commonly known as SPUR. They allow us to use their videos, which we greatly appreciate, as long as we give them credit, which I'm doing here. They're a good organization. If you are interested, I certainly encourage you to join them, both for access to videos like this, but live events they have, online events. They do a lot of good work, present information that's very useful. What we're going to see now is video on 3 conversion projects that have happened, office to residential. They don't really have an immediate application to Petaluma or a clear application. They are in dense urban settings, buildings of 10 stories or more, just not something we have in Petaluma, but it gives an overall sense of how the process could work. And then we have 2 eminent architects. Someone gets smiles out of the word eminent there, to bring the conversation back to Petaluma. So 3 projects you're going to see, 2 in San Francisco, 1 in Chicago. Dan, if you want to get started, that'd be great.
And away we go.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Noah. And Jackson, do you want to pull up the deck? Great. Well, thank you, everyone, for taking your time to spend it with us this afternoon. It seems like a hot topic that everyone's wondering about, because we do have a lot of extra office space that's vacant and we have need for housing. I don't have the answers, but I can just tell you about one case study and what we went through in our decision-making process at 100 Van Ness. Next slide, please. 100 Van Ness was the old AAA office tower. It was completed in 1974. It's 400 feet tall. It's brutalist design. It's got concrete skin with a steel frame, and it's very prominent in the skyline as it's the first tall building coming east from the Pacific Ocean. Next slide, please. AAA had 4 buildings, 3 of these green mid-century modern buildings. There was even a bridge, people might remember, over Hayes Street. And they decided in 2008 that they wanted to go to the suburbs. So they moved to Walnut Creek, and they sold all 4 buildings to a developer who planned to keep it as office, just to modernize it. Then you have Lehman Brothers in September of 2008 and the Great Recession. And by 2011, They hadn't signed a single office lease. So you had vacant office buildings, which for a landlord is pretty terrible, but it also does create an opportunity for conversion, as we'll get to a little later. But the equity, which was CalPERS, they were just tired of feeding it, paying every month on the loan. So they just handed the keys over to the senior lender. It's good to be a senior lender in situations like this. And it was an electrical union pension fund that that took over and then brought us on as partners to figure out what to do next. Next slide, please. One of the things we considered was just reusing the buildings as office. However, the mid-market Civic Center submarket had a 35% office vacancy, which at the time was the highest ever. We happen to be back at that number right now, but it was pretty shocking at the time. And then the other buildings that were our competition that were also vacant had large floor plates, which is what was attractive to the tech clients that were in the market. Hunter Van Ness is much smaller at 15,000 square feet than what ended up being rented by Dolby, Twitter, Uber Square, all a block away. Next slide, please. Another factor was, what is this zoned for? And the timing was pretty good here. The planning department has now since done a number of area plans, but this was the first one. And it was about a 10-year process that completed in 2008, around the time that AAA left. And the planning department, in their wisdom, said, hey, we've got a government district here that really goes quiet at night, yet it's in the middle of the city. There's amazing transit. We should get high density residential and make it 24/7. And the areas you see in red there are high density residential, and we're the northernmost red square. Next slide, please. This is the most important slide in the whole deck. This is how a developer thinks and how they analyze a property. It's not public policy reasons. It's like, what's going to make the most sense economically? They'll look at what is the cost to build or improve, and then what is the value at the end. So for office, doing TIs is going to be relatively low cost, but it was very unclear what the value of this building would be at the end. Residential, it's going to cost a lot more to strip out the building and convert it to residential, but we were starting with a steel frame that we saved and foundations, and that's worth tens of millions of dollars. Also, there have been very little residential built for several years, so the rents were more promising. And note the asterisk. This is at a moment in time. In 2012, residential made more sense. In 2013, the answer would have been office. There would not have been a conversion. So as they say in dating, timing is everything. Next slide, please. This is a floor plate, and it's really just meant to emphasize that we fit 16 units here, and SCB was the architect. But in residential, you care about where the window is, and you can only go so deep. You need to have light for your bedrooms and living rooms. So it would be hard to have any deeper of a building and make it work efficiently. Next slide, please. When doing conversion, there's some nice surprises or benefits, and there's some challenges. This is meant to show a benefit of having high ceilings. Office buildings are built with higher ceilings. Like this is 13 feet. Most residential is 9 to 10 feet. This building also has a massive western exposure. Oh, excuse me, there's my phone ringing. Massive western exposure, which means it's going to bake in the western sun. And so for the first time ever, Emerald Fund decided to do an air-conditioned building. We were able to do that because that horizontal band there is where the air conditioning fit in, and we still have 10.5-foot ceilings, which is very generous. Next slide, please. Depth, unit depth. These units, because of where the elevator bank was, are 44 feet deep. That's really pushing it. You really want to get into 30 to 35 feet. So that was a challenge, but we came up with the idea of, what if we put the bedroom in the middle? We put lights. You have to bring in light and air. We put lights over windows, over the cabinets and along the sides. The building department was okay with it. We were a little nervous about how the prospective residents, tenants would treat it. But to our surprise, they actually liked it a lot. And we've taken this kind of concept of a nested bedroom and used it a couple of times since then. And people like it. And other developers have kind of come onto it as well. So sometimes opportunities create innovation. Next slide, please. Next challenge is, how do you build a building when your existing building takes up the entire lot? There was no open space. There's nowhere to put this tower crane. And the project manager, Ross Asselstein, came up with what was initially a wacky idea that ended up being brilliant. Why not just hang it off the side of the building and have it cantilever above Fell Street? Next slide, please. And so that's what we did. And we had to take off 1,200 panels that weigh like tons and tons each. Never been done before. The demolition contractor was kind of figuring it out, like on the fly. There was some study. But then we're taking it off the building, moving it. It's very windy there, and putting it on a truck. And that's Fell Street. It's over. Like, what keeps a developer up at night is dropping a concrete panel on top of a car or a pedestrian on Fell Street. That didn't happen here. And in fact, the project was named the best residential project in the country that year, in part for innovative things like this. Next slide, please. We had the luck of someone in Fox Plaza living across the street taking a picture every single day. So we had a great document of the stripping of the skin and putting on the new skin. And the reason we did this is, you look in the top upper left, those windows were quite small. And you could see everywhere in this building. It's a view building, and they weren't celebrating the view. So we spent 6 months taking off the skin, 6 more months putting on the new one to really expand the view. Next slide, please. Another opportunity is the mechanical penthouse at the top of the building. Office buildings in the 70s needed a lot of area for their chillers and their boilers. Residential buildings in 2012 don't need that much space. Next slide, please. So we consolidated the penthouse and ended up with this phenomenal, one-of-a-kind, 360-degree roof deck. I've been up there, hundreds of times, and I still am like blown away by the view every time I'm up there. Next slide, please. And we, all the leasing tours end up here, and this is where we try to close the deal. Next slide, please. And this is 100 is the tower, and 150 we also took over the rest of the AAA site and built 150 Van Ness, which is basically the same size as the tower, just turned on its side, 400 feet long instead of tall. And it's 420 apartments and 418, so it's 838 total. Next slide. So to conclude, there were a confluence of factors that led to this building becoming residential, and they all had to be there. Number one, the economy, the Great Recession, and the fact that our competition had better floor plates. Number two, these were vacant office buildings, which is pretty rare. Oftentimes, leases in office buildings are staggered, and any one tenant could stop you from building. Number three, these were manageable floor plates. And finally, the Market Octavia plan had just finished. And we were able to get entitlements in 7 months for 418 units, from filing the application to the Planning Commission hearing. Just amazing. Part of it was planning wasn't that busy, and also it just fit totally within the plan. And last slide. Yeah, that's also, look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Mark. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Hang on a moment while I shoot, where the hell did that tab go? Run back and grab from the 1440 to the 2830.
No, Dan, no. Look,
What?
you should have left it running where it was. The next project that comes up is the second one we wanted to talk about.
Oh, because you had stop at 1440.
Were we at 1440?
Yeah. I mean, if you want
I screwed up. Look,
Okay.
let it keep running at 1440. You go to 2100. My mistake.
Okay.
Yeah, it's another San Francisco project.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Mark. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
I can
Great,
hear.
thanks, everyone. You know, it's funny, Mark and everyone, the vintage of these two buildings, or the style of the two buildings, is actually very similar between, I still call it AAA sometimes, and the Pacific. The Pacific was built a little bit earlier in 1964, originally as the Degoni School of Dentistry, designed by SOM. And at the time, people thought it was a beautiful building. As you can see here, that kind of brutalist approach transferred from the top to the bottom. It was really a fortress along Webster and Sacramento. You can see there, walking along the street was basically a 20-foot wall that was completely opaque and solid, and that carried itself up the building. So we saw dentist students largely closing out the windows. There's a big 9-inch mullion at about eye height. So it was a difficult building, but in a great location. So you can kind of see the end vision of where we landed in roughly 2015 to the right. We'll jump to the next slide here. So for those that don't know, the Pacific, Jackson, whenever you're ready, we'll have. So at the end of the day, we looked at the building as for sale condos, and I'll talk about how we landed there. I talked about the SOM design, the previous use. The site was located on about an acre at Pacific Heights, amazing real estate, where it's very difficult to do any new development, of course, high barrier to entry. About a 250,000 square foot building, 160 feet in height. And we did have a 2-level penthouse on the top, very similar to that of 100 Van Ness, and a large surface parking lot that we were lucky to have space for a crane. The new development that we landed on was 66 large condos in the main building, including 10 townhomes on the surface lot. We had an average 2,000 square foot unit size, which is really big. That's double or even triple the average size of a new multifamily unit in the market right now. And we were able to take that mechanical penthouse you see on the bottom left and transition that into a 2-story penthouse condominium units, 4 of them, 1 on each corner. Throughout the process, we worked very closely with our structural engineers. We had Holmes Structures on the job, and we were able to add about 20,000 feet of net saleable area through completely re-envisioning the building. So we took the old entry to the Degoni School of Dentistry, we moved it to the ground plane. I think if you go to the next slide, Jackson, we show a little bit more on that here. You can see some of the heavy work on the left. That's almost a before, except we'd already taken out one of the levels on the north side of the building. And then you can see a lot of the steel bracing on the mostly concrete structure that we had to go through. Talk about how it started and how it went. What we see is a theme here of potential retrofits of a similar size and scale, but maybe not in Pacific Heights. It started with a great location, a great form. The building did not meet seismic code as it was 50 years old. It really felt like it was built as a fortress, but it came with this entitled height. So if you had just a surface lot today in Pacific Heights, you would never get the neighbors or supervisor or anyone else to endorse a 160-foot tower. So having that in place really streamlined our entitlements. One of the constraints, we had really deep floor plates. Mark mentioned that was difficult to deal with. Mark, at 100 Van Ness, you dealt with them by nesting the bedrooms and doing multifamily. That's one way to do it. What we discovered at the Pacific is, given the neighborhood, we were able to pencil large units for even a higher per square foot value. So we broadened the units, brought in air and light that way, expanded the window line, pushing back 40 or even 50 feet in some cases, but making them feel like actual single family homes. Again, we had a lot of 2,500 and 3,000 square foot condominium units. We also anticipated a cost and schedule benefit, given that the garage was built, the bones were in place. What could go wrong is sort of how it felt. So just to jump into how it went, we did retrofit for seismic code. We did have a lot of unknown unknowns, and that's part of it. I think maybe even in the 60s a little bit more, Mark. So we had a largely concrete building. We had lots of columns that were not plumb. None of the floors were level. We leveled them twice, actually. It was a pretty painful process going through it. The entitlements ended up being much smoother than anticipated, I will say. We were able to, again, kind of be grandfathered in on height. And the residential use actually impacted traffic and parking favorably. So that's another big benefit, I think, if you're looking at residential versus commercial, looking at peak hours and impacts to the community and the street. I think that that's a very positive thing. We were able to really activate the ground plane. That was important to the neighbors by punching holes in the buildings, bringing the entry and the lobby to the corner. I mentioned market demanded larger units. On the cost and schedule, we definitely didn't save a dime on this building by having a building in place. I think it ended up costing very similar to what ground up would have been. In a lot of ways, ground up would have been more simple. We challenged ourselves to think about what went wrong, what we could learn. I do think the newer the vintage of the building, the more streamlined the seismic retrofits and upgrades might be, and the better you're able to anticipate costs and hopefully fewer unknowns. So that's my my short on the Pacific. I think there's one more slide, but there you can see the penthouse retrofit there.
Okay,
Thank you.
now I
And
think
that was it there.
to flip ahead to the 2830 section. And while I'm seeking here, I recommend going back and watching this other section because it's actually the only part that had kind of 80 to 120% AMI market units, but there's a bunch about it that was kind of out of, I understand why Dave said skip it. Anyway, here we go.
Version. This is in Chicago. Obviously an iconic and much beloved building, and also a historic Chicago landmark. The towers, the landmark, and also some elements of the lobby. In this case, we converted the building into 162 luxury condominiums. Next page. So this building had some similar challenges in that the lower part of the building was extremely large floor plates. So in this case, we decided to actually remove some of the square footage and to create 3 new facades facing onto a very tranquil courtyard in the middle of the plan. And that gave us more typical residential double-loaded corridors and depths in which to plan efficient and graceful units. And then in the tower, the challenge was that the floor plates were really too small for current office demands, but made excellent residential floor plates. And the building had some beautiful details and some ornate openings that we're able to leverage into the condominiums. Go to the next page. So the section in the bottom left shows that in addition to cutting the courtyard, we made an addition to one wing of 4 new floors of square footage. So that essentially the lost square footage was recaptured on that wing. And then in the left wing, we created a new pool and amenity pavilion on top of the existing structure. Next page. This shows that kind of typical floor plate before you get up into the tower. Again, showing that the existing original tower on the bottom left, the new pool amenity on the right wing, and then the new addition at the top of the page. Next page. And from the new pool addition and the amenity, we're able to get these wonderful views out towards the Chicago skyline. We actually took the kind of famous Chicago Tribune sign down, refurbished it, repurposed it, and put it back up so that some of the history of the building was maintained and became part of the iconography of the space. Next page. And to Arden's point, sometimes it can be a little bit easier if you've got large units to deal with the various nuances of the floor plan. In this case, we had 3 bedrooms that were roughly 3,000 square feet, 4 bedrooms that are up to 4,000 square feet. So large luxury units that really are able to use a lot of the deep space in the middle of the plan for large closets and bathrooms and so on. Next page. So this is an example of one of the 4,000 square feet, 4-bedroom units that sound like huge units in comparison to what we work with in the Bay Area typically. Next page. And a fairly kind of transitional aesthetic to the interiors, something that we felt was light, modern, but also in keeping with the historic architecture. Next page. Just an example of one of the islands in the kitchens. Next page. And what we were really pleased about is how we could integrate some of the character of the existing building and not erase it at all, but actually bring that into the interiors as well and really celebrate and leverage those beautiful details. Next page. Including some pretty dramatic taller floors that were in the tower and we could work into the residential units. Next page. And where we did make incisions to the outside, this was a new vehicular drop-off that we created. We wanted to keep the architecture again in keeping with the exterior. Next page. And we had some wonderful moments at the top where we created amenities, but we're able to still experience the features of the building, the buttresses and the ornate detail, and look through that as a scrim out to the views of the skyline. That's it, I think. Next page. Yep, that's the last one.
Now
For sharing your
if I
case
manage
studies
to,
at the Hauser. I'm
Actually
always
stop this video and turn off my timer. There we go. And Dave, you're muted.
Yes, I was. Now I'm not. I just want to make a couple of comments before I introduce our two local architects.
ways to increase housing.
Sorry,
production.
my bad.
We good? Okay, that's okay. One couple things that I picked up, and again, I've watched this video several times now. On the Van Ness project, which in some ways is, to me was the coolest of those projects. That's not fair. The Tribune building was great, but Van Ness is the closest one to us. The economics of redoing that building to residential were so marginal that it took the equity owner walking away from the project before it made sense. And on top of that, the timing of it, as the speaker today said, in 2012, it made sense for them to go residential. But by the time they were halfway into the remodeling, the market had turned enough that if they hadn't already begun it, they would have stayed office. So it's really close on whether the office to residential makes work if it takes that close a decision. Second one is, this is a conversation we were having before the forum began, just those of us who are online early. As the floor plates get bigger, it's harder to have units that access exterior walls, where you can have bedrooms with windows to the outside. Apparently, there are some exceptions in the IBC that allow bedrooms to be more internal, but they are restrictive. They require still some access to natural light. They require openings. It just becomes more of a challenge. What you saw in these videos is developers going, let's go to very large units. That gives us more opportunity. But if in Petaluma, we're saying, how do we create more affordable housing? Creating 3,000 square foot, 4-bedroom condos is not the approach we need. So, there are challenges. You saw something on the Tribune building that is perhaps a way around that, which is tear out part of the building to create a courtyard and create more exterior walls. But of course, that becomes expensive. The mayor reached out to me yesterday. He's away on vacation, but he reached out to me going, what would it take to convert retail buildings in Petaluma, underused retail buildings in Petaluma, into residential? And that has all the problems we're talking about here. It's huge floor plate, would take multiple courtyards or light wells coming in, at which point you've lost a lot of your space, and you still have a hard time making units that coming up with bedroom or with unit configurations that really work. So those are the points that jumped out at me. I wanted to get them on the table. Now I will start turning it over to our local experts. First up, Kevin Kelly, who was a senior architect with the Public Building General Services Administration in Washington, D.C., retired from there maybe a year or two ago. But what was interesting is because he traveled around the country, going everywhere with that role, he could live wherever he wanted to, and he chose to live in Petaluma. So he's a 20-year Petaluma resident who's actually lived here for 2 years. And Kevin's also a fellow with me on the General Plan Advisory Committee. So Kevin, give us your thoughts.
Thank you very much. So, yeah, I thought this was a great video. I particularly liked what Hardin Hearing or whatever the second guy said about the future of offices, and he may have said that after we cut off showing the video, but he said that if you really are looking for buildings that are 1920s and before, around 1920 and around 2020. And the reason is because those buildings were built before the introduction of things like fluorescent lighting. And I'll get into this when we get into the kind of, I do have some, I wouldn't call them slides. Ever since I left and retired, I don't have PowerPoint, I don't have Photoshop, etc. So it's kind of a crappy presentation, but I hope the ideas you can tune into. So Dan, if you would forward the next one, the first one.
Here's the first
Okay.
one. Tell me when.
Yeah. So if you look at the history of housing, it is very, it's interesting how the human being has been able to adapt what was already there to their uses. Up at the top is Split, Croatia, and that was the Emperor Diocletian's palace. And in the middle of that photograph, you can see sort of a large, it almost looks like a piazza. It started as the emperor's like throne room. It had a roof on it. It was part of the palace. And if you ever go there, it's a fascinating place to go. There are housing units that are stuck into the palace that was already there. And below you see the Theater of Marcellus in Rome. And you see that people have built apartments into that that theater. And so this is something we have done throughout history, is to use what's already there. It also makes for, it really helps strengthen urban design, and it makes a certain, it's just very interesting when you can see what used to be there and what is there now. Next slide.
Sorry.
Mm-hmm. So
Here we go.
the next slide is where I used to work in Washington, D.C. When I would visit DC. I was actually born and raised there. This is the General Services Administration, which was built in 1917. It's a perfect example of what you want for an ideal office to housing conversion. And the reason is those wings that you see are approximately 70 feet across. There is a access corridor down the middle, which you can see on those facades. And so you always had access to light. The reason being, there was no choice. The lighting, electrical lighting at that period was dim, to say the least. So it had very large windows, a delightful, especially when it was renovated, a delightful place to work. But I also say it would be a delightful place to live, and it would not be that much of a challenge to make it into living apartments. I can tell you, there's no way on God's green earth. This is 2 blocks away from the White House. It's way too valuable real estate, and that often is what happens with some of these office buildings that really would be prime candidates. Now, what happened was, and we wrote an interesting book called Light Matters, and it's coming out shortly. We also wrote another one called Sound Matters, about acoustics in the office. And what happened was, during World War II, fluorescent lighting was introduced into factories, and it was adapted into office spaces. And as I went around the country as Dave was remarking, one thing I found consistent is that human beings despise, with a capital D, fluorescent lighting. And the reason they do is because what developers were able to do was to make these very, very deep office spaces because they could be lighted by fluorescent lighting. What we now know about fluorescent lighting is that it's extremely poor in terms of circadian rhythms, which is a little bit too complicated for me to go into here. But the wavelength of the lights and the fact that they're constant and they're over your head and they cause shadows, etc., makes people really hate that kind of lighting. And I think one of the major reasons people hate to go back to the office, they do not want to go back to the office, is they do not want to be in spaces like that. And that is what we found over and over again in the federal government. Why should I go back to a space where I can barely see the light of day? Whereas at home, I have windows I control. Dan, you had remarked that the dog was barking. I can close the door. You can't do that in most offices that were designed in the 1990s and 1980s and 70s, etc. So they're very dark, and also there tend to be very narrow floor to floors. So you feel very compressed. There's one building in San Francisco, 450 Golden Gate, which is a GSA building, which is basically, I am estimating around 300 feet square. So when you stand at one end of that, when you stand at the window wall and look across the whole thing, because they made it an open office, you can barely see the windows on the other side. They're little specks. Nobody wants to work in a place like that. So the challenge is, since we're not going to be able to turn every single office into housing, is the office, if it's going to survive, needs to be a place that draws people to the office and makes it a communal place where people can interact. And otherwise, we're going to lose a lot. We're going to lose mentoring. How would I have become an architect if I didn't have those old guys teaching me, how to do elevations of parking garages? This is not something you can do over Zoom very easily. So we have to be much more flexible. Some people don't ever have to work in an office again. Some people really do. But we have to make it a draw where people will not go there. On this sheet, and in the interest of time, I won't read all of this, but here are the things that were identified as really ideal, those 5 things there. Finally, structure, land, and location. Those are the things that are really key. Now, the top 10 conversion cities in the country are almost all in the East. They are not in San Francisco. One of the reasons DC is the #1 place, they've had over 1,000 conversions, is that the amount of people who are not going to the office anymore, who were government people that don't need to go to the office, means that a lot of buildings have come on the market. But as we've said, they tend to be large units, and the average rental cost is about $2,160. And Alexandria, Virginia, right across the river, Amazon is going there. So that, it makes it economically feasible. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so what I did today, I've been thinking about this, very much what Dave was saying, that Petaluma, it doesn't have any GSA buildings. It doesn't have it doesn't have a lot of the buildings that have the things that would justify a conversion. So I went to the gym over there at Club One this morning, and on the way back, I sort of just drove around before lunchtime, and I looked at these parking lots of these buildings that we have. Petaluma, I looked it up on commercialcafe.com. It has 575,231 square feet of office space available. Think about that. That, that beginning to get to the square footage of one of the Twin Towers. So it's huge, but only 2.3% of that is considered Class A, which means that it's really modern, everybody wants it, yada, yada. 85.1% is Class B, which means, yeah, it's okay. And 4.1% is Class C. So I drove around and I said, look at these parking lots. Maybe we need to take the idea and turn it upside down or inside out. Maybe these parking lots are where we could very economically build housing above parking and use the existing office building for things like a grocery store on the first floor, a daycare center, and maybe have 2 floors of renovated, desirable offices. That could begin to make these areas of Petaluma, like over near Club One and Applebee's and all that. And the other one that's a real ghost town is when I drive over to Kaiser Permanente. All of these object buildings sitting in the middle of these lawns. It's like a turkey with parsley around it. That is a very old approach to buildings. Buildings are no longer objects. We've been there, done that. They have to be connected to something. They have to have a lot of variety, etc. Next slide. So, oh, yeah, go for it. So, so there's that sort of idea. The existing office is sort of surrounded by housing in the parking lot, and with my very crude Word document tool, I sort of etched out where that might be, and you could still have parking under it if you wanted, but you could also have other cool stuff underneath it. I knew that these parking lots were big. I did not realize how big they were and how underutilized they were until I actually drove over there. And I said, holy moly, we've got to reverse the idea here in Petaluma, not so much taking these buildings, which are very deep, that have a lot of that. I've not been in this particular one, but they probably don't have great floor to floor height, at least on the second floor. They might on the first floor, which would mean they'd make a great grocery store. So I think we need to, in wrapping up here, we need to have developers with vision, who don't want to just make a quick buck. I started in architecture in 1972, and I worked with architects who were working with developers in Washington, D.C. As a matter of fact, we did all of those buildings along K Street, which is now where the lobbyists are. And they were, I'm not proud of them. And I remember, I didn't really have anything to do with the design. I was basically a draftsman, and I was learning my craft. But I remember 2 of the partners behind me were saying, shouldn't we make the floor to floors a little bit higher? I mean, 9 feet, really? I mean, with a mechanical sort of at the edge. I mean, a really, really, really unpleasant space. And it was such valuable real estate, and they wanted that quick buck, to the point where they built to the minimum, to the bare minimum. The interesting thing is 25, 30 years later, I was working for the federal government. And those buildings, which had such low floor to floor and were so unpleasant, were exactly the ones that today are vacant. So, and those are the ones that are being torn down, that are having atriums cut into them so that they're not so dismal, etc. But I think that's very interesting that I was there when the stupid decisions were made. So anyway, as they say in Congress, I yield back.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm still chuckling over I was there when stupid decisions were made. I think all of us at one point in our careers can say that about it.
Yeah.
One thing I will say for the benefit of everyone is parking will be an ongoing topic of conversation. Those of you who've been involved with Know Before You Grow for 4 or 5 years have heard us talk about it. I'm heading off to a couple of conferences next week where there will be some of the national leading experts on parking theory talking. I hope to secure some of them to at least appear via Zoom with us, because I think it's a topic that we really should be covering. There are lots in this town that are just ridiculous. So, Kevin, thanks for bringing it up.
Yeah.
Moving onward to Ross. I've known Ross for years. After a long sojourn in the Northwest, Ross came back to Petaluma in maybe 2006, 2007.
Yep.
I heard some interesting things about him, so I just walked in the front door of his office one day and said, "Hi, we need to talk." And we have been engaged in different things ever since. Ross has a long history in, well, I guess all sorts of different housing options. I probably don't even want to try to recount everything, Ross. But he did a really interesting study on a building you will all know here in Petaluma. I was with him on at least one walk through the building, so it was a good experience, and I'm looking forward to having you share that, Ross, even though your vision never really happened. Okay, so it goes.
Nothing ventured, nothing gained. Thanks, Dave. So go ahead and put up the first slide. And while you're doing that, I'll just give you a brief introduction. Yeah,
I would want to let you do the slides.
oh, so it's not there? Okay, then share the screen.
Well, I mean, you can share the screen.
I can.
Yes. I mean, I can go back and find the slide here if we need
No,
to.
that's okay.
But
All right. So now
if you did it, then
to go to,
that whole landscape.
I'm going into presentation mode there.
Yay. Cool.
Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So I'm a 5th generation San Franciscan. Some of the evidence is behind me on the wall. I won't go into that, but when my parents divorced, I was shanghaied to Seattle. Never really acclimated to the weather or anything up there. Got back here as soon as I could. It just took decades. So I went to the University of Washington, became an architect because in 7th grade, I decided to become an architect. It was safer than a race car driver, which is my other interest, is automobiles. I went to the University of Michigan for my graduate degree, graduated there in '84, came back to Washington, got a certificate in commercial real estate development, augmented that with a certificate from Cornell in hotel development and real estate analysis. So I have been practicing as a architect and developer. In my formative years in Seattle, I spent a lot of time doing core and shell analyses on high-rise buildings, and then executing tenant improvement projects, both as building standard architect and as a custom architect. Once I concluded that, I spent 15 years as a specialist in seniors housing all across North America, different building codes, different jurisdictions, different cultures of interests. So a lot of that has created the person, the architect that I am. Once I came to Petaluma, I have looked at adaptive reuse. My hobby, I should go back and say, is customizing cars. So customizing buildings is really where that segue to adaptive reuse comes in. I first looked at the Hotel Petaluma after it was a hotel, but before it was a hotel again, for the owner, Rob Miller, to see if it could be more successful for him as a senior living environment. I also looked at the Silk Mill, which was a factory building. My friend Skip Summer had developed that into a condominium building, and it got thwarted before it could get approved. Before Hampton Inn moved into it, I looked at it first as a senior living memory care community, then as a city hall, and then finally as a wine and beer venue, somewhat like Copia. Most recently, I was involved in an adaptive reuse in downtown Vallejo on a project on Georgia Street to try to vitalize that building and that community. So with all of that background, one of the projects locally is this building, which I called it the Thomas Continental. It was a building that you would know now as either the Carithers Building or Amy's corporate headquarters. The shadow in the lower left corner is the Mutual Relief Building. Just across the street or to the left is where the Chase Bank is. Teresa and Mark Thomas owned the building for a number of years. It was a retail building. So why is this a subject for our discussion tonight? Well, Amy's is remodeling it into an office building. So there's a template there that makes it work. The name Continental came from the previous hotel across the street that burned down, which was called the Continental Hotel. So there's a little bit of history there. If we go to the next slide, what I hope to convey to you is what some of the, I guess I'm doing that.
Doing the slides.
Yeah, what some of the hurdles, which are in the form of regulations, and then some tools that you can take away from this. And when you go to other buildings, maybe use some of the tools that I'll share with you to see, is this a candidate? Is this a good candidate? Is it, because ultimately, in a lot of these situations, the answer, is it good or not, is it depends. Now, regulations. We have the authority having jurisdiction, and by that, in these cases, I mean specifically the planning department. Is the property zoned either mixed use or residential or some combination that will allow the use to happen? The CBC is the California Building Code. Residential has a lot of construction considerations that office doesn't have. Simply stated, your acoustics between floors, between walls, can you hear your neighbors? Who cares that much in an office? But in a residential setting where it's quality of life, it matters a lot. For example, a very high-end senior living project I did in Bellevue, which was for the top 1%, was a very different building than we had ever done for this client before, who had done lots of senior living projects. I said, don't you want to elevate your construction of the walls and your floor ceilings, because these clients of yours aren't used to having neighbors? They said, no, we want to do it the way we normally do. Bad decision on their part, because that was one of the elements that dropped the quality of that building. So construction type also lays into a lot of discussion. We talked before the session about, can you have a bedroom that's not on the exterior wall? And part of my answer was, yes, you can, if. In the example that we saw in Van Ness, as I looked at that again, I thought, you know what? That building is what's called a type 1 non-combustible building. Most of my experience has been with type 5 1-hour fire rated buildings, or something less than non-combustible. So there's where it depends becomes important. And you're going to have to rely on somebody who's going to dig into the code and help you with that. So you can't say it's, one size fits all. So you're knowing your construction type and the aspects of that are going to influence it. The other component is the residential occupancy. The R occupancy is different than a B occupancy in terms of how many people does the fire department expect to be coming down those stairs?
Mhm.
How are the stairs composed? How is smoke in the case of a fire compartmented? In some of the larger communities that I've designed that have been 5, 6 stories, it looks like one big building on the outside, but because the building code limits how many square feet you can have in a building, there can be walls that go from the roof all the way down to the foundation that separate those buildings into 2 distinctly different buildings, each with their own exiting requirements. So it's complicated. It's not easy. And then the interior environment, we already covered the aspect of daylight, the heating, ventilating, and air conditioning. In a residential setting, you need an electrical panel in each residential unit. That's not there in an office building. So I guess I'm going to leave it there and say there are a tremendous amount of costs taking a building from retail or office to residential. And that's one of the reasons this project you see before you didn't move forward. It was too expensive. So next slide. This is the ground floor plane, and I'm going to come back to that because it's really, in some ways, much less important than what's happening up above, but I'll come back to it, so don't worry. So here's the tool that I want to impart with you. This is the second floor of the Carithers building. Should we be calling it Amy's now?
Yeah.
You guys tell me.
It'll always be Carithers to me.
So from Kentucky Street and Western, the building is about 84 feet back to the alley. And so whatever this dimension is, it's going to be, the block depth, whatever setting you're in, unless you're in a suburban setting like the examples that Kevin was showing earlier. So that's going to be a given. You can't do anything about that on projects like this. So if it's an office building, and I want to go back and talk about, it was discussed briefly what a Class C, what a Class A, and a Class B building are. Generally speaking, as Kevin said, a Class A building is desirable. It's usually new. It's usually a Type 1 non-combustible building. Has a lot of flexibility because of that. Class B building is going to be one that's older, 10, 20, 30, maybe even 40 years old. May not be non-combustible. It's probably not, designed in dimensionally in a way that might be compatible with more open office spaces like is popular today. And Class C is the only thing I've characterized that as. They call them woody walk-ups. There's no elevator. You access it from the outside. We've got a lot of woody walk-ups here. So this is looking at more of the Class B buildings. And as Kevin pointed out, we've got, 83% of the vacant buildings are Class B. So what's important, here's the tool. If you have an exterior window wall, which you better, a private office wants to be about 12 feet deep, and it can be as wide as it needs to be. Where did 12 feet come from? Well, usually you've got a credenza, and then 3 feet, and then a desk, and then a place for a couple of guest chairs. So that 12 feet becomes kind of a minimum, what we call space planning standard. Outside of that private office, you've got about a 4-foot walkway or aisleway, and then you've got about 8 feet of open office administrative spaces. So that comes out to about 24 feet minimum. If we come over to this residential application, this is looking at making the Carithers building into a hotel. So what you see here is the bathroom, a bed, a desk space, and a side chair. But what I want to point out is to get a bedroom of any decent size, you're going to need about 12 feet, 10 feet maybe. And you're going to need, for accessibility, you're going to need a good size bathroom. Now, even in senior living, we can fit even this with the kitchen in that 24-foot depth. We just make them wider. So where we see 1, 2, 3 units in senior living, we would combine these 3 into a 1 or 2 bedroom unit. So that's why it's important to recognize that the 24-foot kind of minimum both in the residential and in the office, is a good place to start. Now, what we can see in the application here is the aisleway or the hallway. And then because our other exterior wall is out here, we've got all this space that's left unassigned. And that is part of the nature of the problem. Single loaded corridors aren't as cost effective as double loaded corridors. So some of these dimensions aren't really helping us in that regard for a residential project. As a hotel, we can make hospitality elements out of it. So there's kind of an out, a gimme out on that. But a conventional residential project is going to be 24 feet, 6 feet of hallway. So there's 30, then 40, 54. 54 feet is a basic double loaded corridor for an efficient residential structure that a developer will want to bankroll. Now, as a developer, yeah, I take exception when I hear greedy developers, because what I want to do is say, we can't get anything financed if it doesn't meet the market requirements. And the market requirement is the banker who says, how efficient is this building? What's the net rentable percentage given to the gross space? And it has to meet a certain metric, or they'll say, no, it represents too much risk. So a lot of the ways that these kinds of projects get done is through private capital or through other government-sponsored tax credits, basically. Okay, so that's all I want to show you on the second, third floor, because it's the fourth floor is just an iteration of that, but we had some more hospitality space out here, so it's really nothing different. So I want to go back to the first floor, and I'm not sure if I can zoom in on this. What I wanted to emphasize, I'll go back up here. The exiting capacity has to be a certain size, and the exits have to be a certain distance apart from each other. You can't put them side by side, and then you have your vertical circulation. So one of the things that made this adaptation to this building so expensive was we moved all the stairs. We moved the elevator because it was stuck back here in the corner, or not even in the corner, out of the corner. It made no sense whatsoever for what we wanted to do. So all of these decisions to make efficiency up above carry down to the first floor. And now that we're down here with the stairs, that's a nice drop right down. Now we can go out to the alley, which the building officials said, yes, we'll accept that because it's an accessible right of way. And here we're out to the street, another accessible right of way. So that's good. Coming out of the elevator, which is not a required, you're not allowed to use it as a required exit, doesn't much matter, but you still want to make sure people can see a visible way out of the building. Now, another aspect of it depends is in a downtown setting like this, planning department generally prohibits putting residential units on the ground floor. And it makes sense. It's not very private to have residential units on the ground floor. If you have a bunch of parking out here, okay, then you can landscape, you can create privacy. But the other aspect is the cities want to have interactive street front. They want to see activity. Even when I've done senior living projects in an urban setting and we've had our dining room here, they said, can you make it open to the public? Because if it just looks like a club, that doesn't activate our street much. So this became was proposed as a buku, which is a restaurant down in San Francisco. And this was part of the retail that was to keep this section activated. So, there's a lot of things that go into this. It's the code regulations that are going to drive up the costs, that are life safety. You can't, don't argue life safety. There are planning considerations that you can and maybe should argue, and financial conditions that you will probably have to argue for. And then your core and shell standards, finding the right fit. So, as someone told me when I was looking at the Silk Mill, trying to turn it into a beer and wine venue, the guy says, let somebody else, my partner, potential partner says, let somebody else break their pick on that one. So developers get a bad rap, but they spend a lot of time, I know, and money of their own trying to find the right deal. So when they do find one that works and they make a lot of money, it's not all gravy. A lot of it's filling the hole they left from the previous misses and failures. So I hope
Good point.
I've made the right point on that. So I'll release my screen unless we want to, any questions on those exhibits.
Yeah, I have one question. This is Kevin. A really excellent presentation, and I think that building is a bear to do anything with. I see that you were able to puncture the exterior walls there on the sort of right. As it is now, I think there's like one weird window up at the top on the right.
Yeah, there's a 3 windows on the 3rd floor on each
Yeah.
side.
And, I guess that was fine if it's a furniture store. Did you run into any kind of historic preservation things with puncturing a, I guess you would call this a art moderne kind of building?
Yeah, it's definitely art moderne. And I did talk to at the time, the president of the Historic Planning Commission. And he found this proposal favorable. However, that's one person of a whole commission. And so I can't say that this would have been accepted.
Well, it actually, I think it looks quite nice. And that part of the challenge of that building, even for Amy's, is that huge expanse of closed walls. So I hope Amy's gets a really good lighting designer in there.
You're right. I think they will.
Yeah, they can afford it. Yeah.
Given the small size of the crowd this evening, I think we can just entertain direct questions. If you want to begin raising your hands, if you have questions to ask, please do so. But I'm going to take the priority to ask my own question. The topic tonight was office to residential conversion. But what we heard from the mayor is that he thinks in Petaluma it may be retail to residential conversion is truly the challenge. I think we heard from Kevin that his solution is don't even try. Take the parking lot, put 4 stories of new residential there, and use the existing building for something else. Let me just, and this is not a specific example. In fact, I'm intentionally going to one that is not a real example. Don't anybody quote me on this. What if tomorrow Whole Foods wanted to go out of business? What would you do with that site? I know that you can't know until you dig into it deeper, but just top of your head, what would you do with the Whole Foods site? Either one of you, feel free.
Be interesting.
Well, what works in Petaluma is a gym.
Not another one.
Somebody's going to want to move.
We are so thick. Yeah, no, that's true. It would be a good. It would be a good gym.
Would it work? Would it then work then to put residential in the parking lot?
I think you could put residential above the parking lot. Isn't, you know what I mean?
Podium?
Parking at one level, or not. Maybe you have less parking. There is next to Whole Foods, I think it's subsidized housing. There's a little kind of interesting alleyway of housing right there.
It's a PEP housing project. Yes, it's
Yeah,
subsidized.
Yeah. And, I could imagine something like that working there pretty easily. In terms of the building of Whole Foods, you'd have to look at it. I mean, it is only like 1 story. One of the solutions could be solar tubes, which are skylight. I have 4 of them in my own house. They're wonderful. They're cheap as dirt to put in, and they give you natural light. You could do that, especially if you have to re-roof it. It's always a great time to think about adding skylights when you have to re-roof something, and those don't leak. The other possibility is, maybe you could do some sort of take the roof off and leave some exposed trusses or something. It could be a nice restaurant or something like that.
I think before, I know Dan has hand up. I want to give it to him in just a moment, but just before we close on this, what I'm hearing, I think from both Ross and Kevin is the Whole Foods building can never become residential. There's just nothing there you can really work with.
Just up above. What Kevin was just saying.
Yeah.
If you go up above floors 2 through 4 residential, then the grocery store has the opportunity to be any kind of service commercial.
But you
Right.
could you find a way to add stories above that building without tearing the building down?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
You'd have to put in new like footings or whatever, and a matter of fact, in Washington DC, there's a lot of what's called air rights buildings, where they were very low buildings before, and they sell the right to what's above them.
Okay, and I've heard that, but there's no way you could use the Whole Food floor space itself as it exists now for residential.
You'd have to put a lot of windows in it.
The only thing I can think to do, this is just way off the top of my head, is if the Whole Foods building is a large rectangle, then you build a residential tower that's a slightly smaller rectangle, so that the difference between those two and there creates a retail depth that's usable, that's not so big like a grocery store. And then you let the residential come down, and the first floor of that residential is your gym, extra storage, service things like that, maybe even coffee shop. A project I worked on in Santa Rosa, 888 4th Street. It's like an 8-story apartment building. The first floor has a lot of these kinds of community features, which aren't it's a B occupancy and an A occupancy, but I won't go into that. It's not a living environment. So yeah, you can take that part of a multi-tenant building and make the ground floor usable in that regard, and then have some periphery things that are on the side.
One of the reasons I like building above the parking lot is you don't run into nearly these kinds of problems, because you're always going to find undiscovered conditions when you go in there, and that just can be a terrible headache.
The 3-hour fire resistance between parking and a residential necessitates a concrete deck.
Mhm.
Okay.
So you got to get a lot of units out of it.
Yeah, because that's expensive to build. Yeah.
Okay. No, thank you. You were saying exactly what I expected you to. I just wanted to make sure that message was in the recording. So
I hate to be so predictable.
hey, I've been around you long, I'm both of you long enough to know where this conversation is going to end up. Dan, did you have something you wanted to ask? You're muted.
Thank you. Yeah, so a couple of comments quick. Rather than solar tubes in our house, we put in a couple tens of thousands of lumens of flat panel LED in our living room for the quarter. It does amazingly well for artificial light, so I'm a little bit less worried about external than I used to be, although all of the things about fire escape register. And I just wanted to draw the connection. I hear a lot of people say, well, the Kmart building, there's a building we could put something in, and that's kind of like all of the problems with the Whole Foods building, but even more so.
Yeah.
The question I had is, given that everybody is complaining about our way overuse of or oversupply of retail in Petaluma, and I don't actually know whether or not that's true, or whether we just don't have enough people residential in those areas to actually use the retail. How do you make is there a way to make an argument to a planning commission that the additional ground floor residential would actually make up for itself in foot traffic versus whatever amenities that ground floor as retail would offer?
What about live workspace for artists and stuff like that? I think that like Kmart, I don't know it intimately, but I imagine it's a very simple structure with open web steel trusses and basically just post and beam type thing. What's the possibility for taking out some of those that the roofing elements, so that you get more light in a U shape, sort of like the Chicago Tribune building did that, where they added a courtyard. I think that structure, kind of structure used in Kmart and all that sort of stuff, is probably easy enough that it would be quite a bit easier to disassemble. Ross, would you agree with that? Or?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Sometimes it's more expensive to work around something than just to eliminate it and have a little bit more freedom.
Right.
Dan, to your question, I think Haystack Landing may have been an interesting exploration of how to keep a ground floor activated with a little bit of retail here and there. And as I recall, some folks are saying, yeah, but nobody's, other than the residents in the building, no one's going to use it because there's no convenient place to park. Maybe there'll be a day before I die where that won't be such an issue anymore. So there was another point I was going to make, but I forgot exactly what it was. I know the Oyster Cove project has allocated a number of square feet on the river to a building that kind of makes things activated. So they're looking more at a centralized location for the activity and let the rest, be residential. I know the other point I was going to make, because Kevin brought it up, was live work. In decades past, live work hasn't been successful, but since more people are working from home, I'll bet that's different now.
Yeah. And, Petaluma is a very artistic place. There's a lot of, one of the federal government's sculptors, they give out these huge grants for art, was from, I believe, Petaluma or Santa Rosa for the ATF building. So it's a very, art is kind of part of our DNA here, which is cool. We should capitalize on that. To Dan's point about lighting, when we finally get light matters out, it really stalled during COVID. I mean, the great thing about GSA, working with GSA, we had access to such incredible engineering and architectural talent that we put this guidance together. And one of the things that I'm very excited about with LED lighting is that it is becoming much more economical, and it's in the very near future where we can adjust the LED, because LED is basically, it's a number of tubes that have, or filaments or whatever you want to call it, that have color in them. And I can adjust it so that in the morning there's more blue light. So I'm ready to go. The problem with the old-fashioned office is that it was blue light all day long. So that literally people were not getting rested like they should. And now, Dan, for your next project, there are controls that can be put on a timer, and you can get, towards the end of the day, your house can turn into a sort of a lovely, much more orange, which tends to calm you down, the sort of a campfire. So, I think artificial lighting is going to make a big, big difference on the livability of buildings that are maybe the Class Bs, make them much more livable.
Cool.
Any other questions out there? Have we given you too much information? Have we bored you to death? Hello.
Hello.
I did want to note that the Honolulu conversion that we skipped was interesting to me, because for a couple of reasons, because that was the only one that hit 80 to 20% or 80 to 120% of AMI as their market, whereas all of the other ones that we saw were hugely luxury things. That hugely luxury and density can't, well, density with 4,000 square foot unit, but go together if you build your soundproofing nicely enough. But also that the Honolulu one was the one that wasn't a total business conversion, that it was done as a renovation with tenancy in place, which meant that they had to figure out a lot of stuff about multi-story drain and
Yeah.
and that kind of opened my eyes to Petaluma doesn't have a lot of multi-story that we can, or a lot of tall multi-story that we can convert, but opened my eyes to a lot of the, oh yeah, if you're gonna gut the building and restart, it really is easier when you gut and restart.
And one of the more difficult things is what was pointed out, that it's really the fire separations between occupancies that get really hairy in a situation like that. I mean, sometimes it's easier than other. By the way, I really have to give kudos to Ross for the comment he made about acoustics. Acoustics is, 75% of office workers say their number one complaint is acoustics. And one of the reasons they don't want to go back is because of acoustics. And I am convinced, having lived in a row house in Washington, D.C., that a lot of the violence that we see in urban areas has to do with the lack of adequate soundproofing between neighbors. Because when they wake you up at 3 o'clock in the morning, you do want to kill someone. And, it's only my wife holding me back from me going out there and, yelling and screaming. It's very important for civil society that acoustics, and by the way, the acoustics in the United States are considered the lowest requirements in the industrialized world. At least that was true 10 years ago. I don't know if it's still true now. But we are always going to the minimums.
I know even in this separated single family residence, I do get concerned about my neighbors when I'm practicing my arpeggios and working on my voice.
Uh-huh.
That Chris's hand is up.
Hey, everybody, just curious. So after all of this, are there, whether it's retail or whether it's office space that's vacant, are there key buildings in town that we should have an eye on going, oh, that could be repurposed? I mean, when we look at, like it as a community, maybe where we want to put some pressure or, point a finger or go, is there anything that's worth looking at?
I think anything that's been vacant for over a year is worth looking
Yeah.
at.
Yeah.
So are there, you guys know buildings better than I do. I mean, I'm not an architect. When you go around town, are there buildings that you go, oh man, I'd love to have a crack at that one?
Yeah, and I do. But I will tell you, the first barrier is not the building, it's the owner.
Yeah.
Some
Right.
owners are just happy to let things sit. and
Yeah, I know that's the issue with the Kmart building, that the owner, the owner is not, he's known for not being a creative soul. But I just wondered if there were other buildings that maybe it seems more possible.
Yeah, that's where developers are always on the hunt for something that will work for the community.
Well, I think that these parking lots, these huge parking lots, I mean, we've been talking about, changing zoning so that we can get more housing. And it doesn't necessarily, you don't necessarily have to have parking under it. But that's a real, I lost after rethinking the whole shopping center where Kmart and Simmer and all this, because there's a lot, that's a very spotty shopping center, it seems to me, in terms of its success, and has a lot of space in it.
So Chris, there's, just to give you an idea, there are a number of properties I've taken a run at. Across from the museum, the Petaluma Historical Museum, there's that one-story building.
Oh, yeah.
With the dentist in it. I took a look at that as a multi-story building. I couldn't get the owner to get to a reasonable price on that. I looked at the little tiny lot next to Umpqua Bank, and I couldn't make, frankly, it wasn't big enough to make anything work there. I have plans for the property that's on, by saying plans, meaning I've drawn them, I know what I would do. For the property on D Street and the Boulevard that used to be the old gas station many years ago. And that one's still encumbered with Chevron. I put an offer in, I don't know, 3 years ago. And it's just, they're not, that one's complicated. So yeah, there are people out there. There are realtors, there are developers who look for opportunities wherever they can find them. And it's hard work to.
How about Payran and the Boulevard? There's that thing that used to be a pizzeria. It's a real weird building. And then there was an Indian restaurant that went out of business there across from Lucky's, that whole sort of Lucky thing. You know, that strikes me as
Okay.
ripe for development.
Well, yeah, can I respond to that one?
Yeah.
Kevin, it's like you teed that up for me. Thank you very much. I've been working with the fairly recent purchaser of the old, it was really a Sonic drive-in originally.
Oh,
He has secured entitlements for a 7-unit mixed-use building, very small units, 400 square feet to 800 square feet, all second story with a retail underneath. What he is telling me as of 6 weeks ago is he has found a path to financial feasibility using a combination of prefab and panelized construction. He is now working toward demolition and finishing up construction documents.
great.
I'm thrilled by that. The former Indian restaurant, I just learned 2 weeks ago when he showed up at my front, when the developer showed up at my front door with a pastry for me, a French pastry shop out of Santa Rosa, Sarmientis, I believe, has just taken a lease on the former Ambrosia building and will be bringing a French pastry shop into that space.
Oh, boom.
So you asked the right guy.
Oh, no,
So-
but that's such a weak corner. You know, it should be, I mean, it has some great stuff on it, like that that elevator thing, and and some interesting old buildings there. And then there's this it's sort of like a tooth is knocked out there. You know?
Well, and actually, to add one more thought to it, I'm wearing a different hat now. We mentioned earlier the SStat 15-minute neighborhood study that we'll be presenting at the next Know Before You Grow, which, by the way, will be the first Know Before You Grow in person since the pandemic. So please put in your calendars now, June 14th. Anyway, the AIA study calls out 9 potential neighborhood nodes for walkable commercial, and one of those is at that corner. So a lot of people are seeing opportunities there.
All right.
Cool. I think the rest of the conversation seems like in person tomorrow at Aquas.
Sounds good.
All right.
We
Cool.
went over an hour and a half, probably our longest forum ever.
Yeah. All right.
I used to have a girlfriend who said I could chat the head off a dummy. That's what she all right. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, cool.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
folks.
Bye.
Bye.